We all set. All right, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone this evening to the Wednesday night study here at the Lighthouse Community Church and those who are joining us on the live stream. We are continuing our study in the book of Ephesians. We are in the 6th chapter, and we started off looking at verses 1 through 3. So that's probably where we're going to pick it up this evening. All right, just to kind of refresh our memories, let's go ahead and run through 1 through 3 again. Paul writing to the Ephesians, to the fellowship in Ephesus, and chapter 6, verse 1, he said, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you, and that you may have or live long on the earth." Okay, that's where we kind of ran over last Wednesday, and that's where we're kind of picking it up today. I started off talking about how children were not excluded from the importance of unity among the fellowship, the brethren in Ephesus. And, you know, for a lot of people, maybe even in our contemporary culture and time today, where children are just kind of like, well, they're of lesser importance, that they're not really essential as far as unity when it comes to the household of faith. And Paul just went straight into it and says, you know what, that thinking is wrong. Children are extremely important to the unity of a fellowship. And that's where I kind of started off with last time, so I'm not going to really go over that too much at this time. But I did also mention that that type of thinking, that children are capable of raising themselves, that is just so erroneous, that is so mistaken. It's very, as I said, it's lazy, it's irresponsible, it's downright cowardly for parents to think that they can do that. And unfortunately, even our society today, that's a pretty popular way of thinking, where parents are basically saying, well, they're smart enough, they'll figure it out, and they just want to wash their hands of them. That's downright sinful, quite honestly. So, we're going to start off with the idea of obedience. Okay, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And to obey is basically obedience. You know, we know what obedience is, right? When you're following the instructions or the request of someone who asks you to do something, you can say yes, you can say no. If you say yes, then you're being obedient, right? So obedience, which is basically submission, isn't it? Because to be obedient to something means that you're going to sacrifice your own will, your own desires, in preference of what someone else is requesting of you. So obedience is basically submission. So what Paul says here is that obedience to parents, that it has its foundation in the authority of God. Because that first verse says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. And that's really important, because I think I touched on this a little bit last time, where when we looked at the commandment to wives, that all of her submission as a wife to her husband was based upon being obedient and submissive to him. But Paul made it very clear. He says, you do this not because he's such a great guy, you know, maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but you do it because it is commanded not so much by him, but by God. And it's important that he put that there, because, you know, what we had studied about the role of being a wife, going all the way back to Genesis, we said that's kind of a lot to ask. But when God made it very clear to the Apostle Paul, he says, you know, I'm asking a lot. You know, God is asking a lot, but you have to remember it's bigger than just your own little world, your own flesh and blood world. This is in direct submission and obedience to the will of God. So all of a sudden, it's like, be obedient to my husband. Paul says, yeah, that's important and that's the basic idea, but more importantly, be obedient to God. So that took it into a whole different realm of importance. Same thing for husbands. Paul made it very clear to the husbands. It's like, for all the things that you are required to do for your wife, and we covered a whole list. There were 2 verses, I think, that were in regards to the wife, but for the husband, there's a lot more responsibility, things that he was held accountable for. But it came to the same principle. Husbands, do these things, but don't do it like you're just looking, like your sight is so short that you're only looking how it pertains to your wife. He says, no, do it as you're doing it as unto God, which all of a sudden made it way more important. So, but here we see that it was extended also to children. Obey your parents in the Lord. He was literally telling the children, okay, be obedient to your parents as if you were being obedient to God himself. I mean, how much weight does that carry? You know, it's important enough to be obedient as children, and we were all children at some point, right? And how important was it to be in obedience to them? And I don't know about you, but growing up, you know, I really didn't know the Lord or had any relationship with God. So the whole idea of being obedient to my parents as in to God, I had no idea about that. I had no concept of, you know, being obedient to my parents like I'm doing it to God. Did any of you guys have that idea? I mean, everyone is different. My past experiences were being raised in a household that, you know, wasn't born again, didn't have a relationship, you know, an intimate relationship with God. We were just basically culturally, you know, aware of God. So, but here Paul makes it very clear. But more importantly, he says, obey your parents, verse 1, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Okay? Think about that. The obedience, it's not just right. I mean, because if I were to ask you, okay, tell me something that is right. What does that even mean? Can you think of something that you think is right? Anything at all? Well, that's kind of the idea, and the simple fact. And you guys do have your microphones, right? But the principle that I'm trying to establish here is that one thing that you may think is right, is everyone going to think that that's right? No, because it's very arbitrary. It's very, very selective. But when Paul says that here, he says that obedience is not just right, it is beneficial both inwardly and outwardly. Obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. So there's something about it that's a little bit more than just, you know, right or wrong. You know, 2 + 2, you know, is going to equal 4. You say, well, that's right. But I'm supposing also that people that are math majors, which I am totally not, that they can come up with other equations and stuff to kind of challenge that or look at it differently, or, you know, where right isn't just so simple. But this idea of it being right is to be beneficial to the children outwardly and inwardly. Because that's really kind of summed up, as we will get to, when you look at verse 3. After he says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, he says, that it may be well with you, and that you mayest live long on the earth. So the whole idea of it being right, about honoring your father and your mother, and obeying, being in submission to your parents, Paul is telling the children, says, if you do this, he said, as you're doing it as unto the Lord, and if you're doing it because it is quote unquote right. Now, he says, if you do this, something's going to come of it. Right? Something's going to come of it. But what's going to come of it is summed up in verse 3. He says that it may be well with you. Well is kind of a vague general term, right? But you get the idea. It's like, would you rather have things be well with you or bad with you? Some people say, well, that depends. It's like, it really doesn't depend on anything. It's a simple observation. You have a life. You want a good life or do you want a bad one? Well, anyone who's honest and has, reasonable mental capacity, they're going to say, if I get to choose between the two, I'd like to have a good life. And that makes sense, right? For anyone who says, I want a bad life, it's like, man, you got issues. You need therapy. You need something. But Paul makes it very clear, speaking of the children, and maybe even to the children. Well, he is speaking directly to them. He says, if you do these things, the end result is going to be that it's going to be well with you. Things are going to be good. Things are going to be good. And what else?
You may live long on the earth.
A long life. Okay. I heard one guy at the gym once. There was a conversation that was going on. And I don't remember offhand what the whole basis to the conversation was, but the guy was telling some other guy, he says, you know what? He says, he said, and he kind of made it like jokingly, but he said, you know what? I asked God for a good life, not a long one. And I heard that, and it's like, well, can't you have both? But he was settling for, it's like, well, if I have to make a choice, I'm looking for good and short rather than long and not so good. And you get his whole rationale and thinking, but the more that I thought about it, it's like, in the household of faith, you don't have to choose between the two. You can have both. A life in this present world that we live in, right? And one that continues far beyond that into eternity. Because when we look at the human existence, as I've always said, and I firmly believe, and that's that we are spirit beings. This body never meant to last forever. And after the fall in the garden in Eden, quite honestly, with the state that man inherited after that, God was really merciful. He was really merciful, saying, you know what, you're in a bad place now. Your life is really corrupted, and there's really nothing that you can do about it to save your mortal existence. And God, what if God says, okay, well, too bad for you. That's your whole lot in life. There's nothing beyond. But instead, God said, I'm not going to leave you in that condition. If anything, our life is very temporary. I mean, when you're young, what do you look forward to? For those of you that can still try to remember, what was it like? The main thing about being young, maybe Bree can testify to this, but the simple fact is when you're young, you can't wait for what? To grow up, right?
Get your license and car and all the things.
Yeah. All the bells and whistles, everything that you look in life, say, I can't wait to grow up. When you're older, you can't help but look back and say, man, why was I in such a hurry? All of a sudden, my life got really, really complicated. It got more difficult. It got maybe troublesome. That's not saying that's just part of life. But am I wrong when I say that, the older we get, we look back and say, what about this or what about that? I read something recently where someone wrote, and probably on social media, and they said, the reason why older people love to look back and love to consider things, and love to talk about things when they were younger and, when they were not as old as they are now, the reason why they love to look back on those days is because they know that they have fewer ones ahead. Make sense? And I thought, wow, that's pretty insightful. But that's part of the promise that Paul was speaking to the children at Ephesus. He said, if you do these things, he said, it's going to be good for you. It's going to be well. Not bad. And even the things that are maybe difficult, you still have hope. What about people in this world that don't have hope? They're in a sad state. But in the household of faith, no matter if you're young, no matter if you're old, or somewhere in the middle, still have hope. Because there is a God, there is a living God. And the more that we go through life and experience Him in so many different ways, whether you're at home, whether you're at school, no matter what you do, the more you experience God personally, not based upon what someone said, but what you find out for yourself. And then as you continue to grow up and mature and, graduate, get a job, go to school, whatever, any difficulty that comes up, any difficulty, you can look back on your life and say, God was there. And I firmly believe, because I know that to be true, He's here now and He'll always be there. He even says that in His Word, that He would never leave nor forsake, right? I'm not making that up. So anyway, that it will be well with you, but also that you would have long life on the earth. How long is long? That's a relative statement, okay? But better to have a life on this earth that is filled with hope, with peace when everyone else is freaking out, and yet you find yourself saying, I'm okay. So that's the benefit of that, right? Both outward and inwardly, we would be blessed. The children are called to honor. Verse 2, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Okay, they are called to honor, and that word translated from the Greek, it means to revere or to place a great value upon them, upon their parents. To revere someone is to hold them in a very lifted up kind of perspective. It's like having parents and you look up to them and you really appreciate them. You really gain a sense of comfort, a sense of security, and you know that comes from them. And that's really kind of a turnaround, because a lot of times, maybe you've experienced or seen where your kids kind of get into as old as some of us are. They get into these photo albums. How many of you know what a photo album is? And even people online, on the live stream. There are a lot of young people, it's like, you mean like a video? It's like, yeah, back then, it really wasn't so much a video as it was just pictures. And they see their parents young. And for them, that kind of freaks them out. It's like, that's you? They have this idea that we were always this way. And to me, that's like the weirdest thing, And it is and it isn't, because I still look at pictures of my mom and dad when they were young, and I go, man, that's pretty freaky. That's weird, And I just always knew them, in their middle age and as they got older. And that was my whole perception. But when you understand what they have done, what they have sacrificed, what they have given for your protection, for your nourishment, for all those things, and they must have, because you're here, right? But anyway, it says to honor, to revere them, place a great value upon their parents, which is it's the fifth commandment of the original 10 received by Moses from God. Okay? Now, how does he say that in verse 2? Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. And that to me was something that's like, it's part of the 10, but it's definitely not the first one. But it's the first one, as he says, with promise. And kind of surprisingly to me, I kept looking that up. I kept researching that, trying to find, like, what exactly does he mean by the first commandment with promise? Because we already know it's not like number 1 of the big 10, right? So, what do you think, based upon hearing that? Paul says, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. What do you gather? Or now that you're thinking about it? You guys are all, come on, Google search. Well, guess what? I'll tell you right now, I couldn't find any 100% agreement on what that meant. So you may find a couple of angles on it, but from what I found out, there were a lot of ideas of what was implied there, but no complete consensus on, okay, this is definitely what it means. You got your microphone? Your Mr. Microphone?
All right. Isn't it referring to like Exodus 20:12, where it says, honor your father and mother that your days may be prolonged in the land which Yahweh has given?
It is reference to that, but still...
Isn't that the promise?
Huh?
Isn't that the promise?
It is, and yet there were other authorities that looked at this quote idea of promise, and they were saying that, when you really consider all of the 10 commandments, they all kind of, their end result, if you're obedient, they all are filled with promise. Aren't they? And that was just one of the opinions.
But do they say that like in that verse where it actually gives a promise?
No, it's implied.
But this one says it.
Yeah, but still, they all didn't agree with that.
But it's right there.
Yeah, I know.
Exodus 20:12.
Well, let me tell you what some of the other ideas were. But anyway you look at it, verses 1 and 2, they all lead to 3, which says that's the end result. You obey your parents, you honor them, all, these things that are mentioned. Long life. A good long life. A blessed life. Okay? It is referred to by Paul as the first commandment with promise. However, when connected to the stone tablets received by Moses, it's been debated as to its meaning. It's been argued that all the commandments offer an implied promise, blessing, when obedience is given, which that in and of itself is true. Every one of the commandments say, if you do this, you're going to be blessed. And that's part of the promise. Okay, and that's what a lot of authorities say, that that's a reference to. Regardless of, reading Exodus, a lot of them still kind of debate that. So I just wanted to give you a better idea. Is it like a salvationary thing? No. But the way that he kind of words it, it has stirred up some debate as far as whether it was phrased adequately. So it's also been held that the first commandment label, because if you just read it as the first commandment with promise, people will go to the Big Ten, right, and say, it's not the first one. And it's not. So they say, so it can't literally mean that, so it must mean something else. So anyway, it has also been held that the first commandment label was also a stressed importance of the need for honoring father and mother, but within Paul's teaching, the honoring of parents brings forth a general promised divine anointing of one's actions and a long life, which we read in verse 3. Now, that being said, what some of the sources said that when Paul referred to it as the first commandment with promise, they were arguing that he was saying that calling it the first commandment of promise was really putting a stress on it, or a heavy emphasis on the whole idea of honoring parents, honoring father and mother. So, it's like you may say, well, is that a stretch? Is it not a stretch? I don't know, but those are 3 examples of what that means, because it is worded a little odd, and that is viable based upon the different ideas that have come from it. Okay, so like I said, is it a salvationary thing? No. Is it like the old doctrine hangs on it? No. But since we're, looking at children and their obedience to their parents as unto God, and for Paul to mention it that way, and what it leads to in verse 3, it's important to just kind of stop and look at it, because it is worded a little ambiguous, I guess. Maybe to some, maybe not to others. Anyway, the end result was verse 3. Okay? Any questions on that, or before we move on? Alrighty then.
I have maybe a question or comment. I know when we were talking about the wives submitting to your husbands as to the Lord, and we said, well, what if the husband is a non-believer? In this situation, what if one parent is a non-believer, or if both parents are non-believers? Then what? I think it still applies, right, to the children. You're obeying as unto the Lord, assuming that the parents aren't telling the children to do anything downright dangerous or wrong.
You're dealing with hypotheticals.
Yeah.
As far as, well, what if the parent is, doing this or doing that? Are children still responsible for being obedient? What was that one part where I mentioned that things like that were obvious, issues? Like, let's say that the parent was asking the child to do something dangerous. Okay, now, under those circumstances, I would think, and this is just my opinion, okay, but the whole idea of something that would be life-threatening, that the child would probably more than likely not be under commandment to partake in that. But bear in mind also, always consider the audience. Okay, who is Paul speaking to? The fellowship at Ephesus, right? He's speaking to believers. And that being said, believers in Ephesus that are true believers, that's the sort of thing that shouldn't be coming up See, so because you're looking at the worst case scenario, but in the household of faith in Ephesus, that probably would not have been an issue, even though Ephesus was pretty flaky, pretty weird. So, like I always say, always remember your audience of who is Paul speaking to, and is his audience or congregation, the fellowship in Ephesus, would they be prone to be obedient to what he's saying? I would think so. They're probably hearing it for the first time as we talked about it, but they're there and they have this heart and mind to be taught. So I think if we know the audience, and we do, it would be kind of the better case scenario. Were they perfect? No. But were they desiring to move in a right direction for their families, especially for their children? I would think so.
I was just remembering when Brother Eddie and I used to do youth group, teenagers, and we had a lot of teenagers that would come to youth and to church whose parents were not Christians. They didn't go to church anywhere. And there was times where, I remember a few times where some of the teenagers could not come to youth group or even to church because the parents had said, you know, they had done something at home. They had disobeyed or done something at home. And the parents...
They would punish them.
They would punish them by saying they took away something that they liked, which was coming to church.
Yeah.
Or coming to youth group. And, you know, they would talk to us and say, well, you know, that's not right. They don't want me to come to youth group because you know, and they had done something that was disobedient during the week, whatever it was. And it's like, well, that's how your mom and dad are punishing you. I guess that's their choice, you know, but it was a little different.
Yeah, you know, and now that you mentioned those occasions, you know, how easy, but also how reckless would it have been for, you know, Sister Yola and myself to tell those young people, say, you know what? Well, your parents are wrong. They're keeping you from God, so you don't have to obey them. You don't have to listen to them. You know, you do what God says, and you come to fellowship, you know, and you just blow them off. Oh, that would be criminal. I mean, we never did that because we had enough sense, spiritual sense, to just realize, you know what? Do not cross them. You know what? Be obedient and, you know, show them a better way. And we're just going to trust the Lord that, you know, your parents will see it for what it is. And that's not to manipulate them, but that's just to do what's right. Obey your parents. And that way you will find favor with them.
But generally, you know, I remember asking some of the girls, well, you know, whatever they had done actually was, they had done something that was, they were being disobedient to whatever their parents had asked them to do.
Yeah.
So there was some learning. There was a lesson for the young girls to learn. It's like, okay, well, if your parents told you not to stay out till midnight and you did, then you're being punished.
Yeah. They had done something like kick over a hornet's nest and then say, well, why are they being mean to me? It's like, what did you do? I didn't do anything, but blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, you did enough. Because remember, you're angry with your parents, but you're speaking to people who are parents. So we're actually looking at it from the other side. It's like, don't incur their wrath because you did something that was irresponsible. And now you pay the price. You know, you change your disobedience for obedience and let God kind of, you know, smooth things over. So, yeah, you know, those three verses are pretty powerful.
A lot of that's going to be answered actually in verse 4, because a lot of it is, verse 4 talks about exasperation because it leads to rebellion. A lot of the hypotheticals it kind of goes in that direction, and that's why it's important why in verse 4 it talks about not to provoke, not to exasperate. So I think that was a great follow-up verse to verse 3.
Think so? Okay, because it's connected, obviously, because it's speaking about fathers. And notice here that specifically to fathers. Okay? But to me, it kind of like was a little bit of a shifting of gears where it still applies to the children, but it addresses it more from the father's responsibility. And that's why to me, let's just go ahead and read that. And you fathers, now notice, it doesn't say, and you fathers and mothers, and you parents. No, this is kind of like back to, putting it in daddy's lap, so to speak. And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Okay, Paul singles out the father's dominant role in a child's instruction and development. Does that mean that mothers have no responsibilities with that at all? No, it's not saying that. But where there's like, as they say, where the rubber meets the road, you have a priest of the family, that is the father. Okay? And I've said this numerous times, and I mean absolutely no disrespect to their effort or to their love for caring for their children, but every time I've heard some mothers say, well, I've had to be both father and mother. And I don't necessarily say anything, but I think you can never be father. Because biologically, spiritually, socially, you're not. Now, that's not taking anything away from them and for all that they try to provide for their children. But the reality is, you can't be father any more than father can be mother. That's just simply clearly put, defined. But like I said, I don't mean that in any disrespect, but just a reality. Okay? So Paul singles out fathers for the dominant role in a child's instruction and development. This reflects a fundamental responsibility upon a father that has its roots in Joshua 24:15. Someone want to read that? Or who knows the part of that I'm really kind of focusing on? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And there's more to it. So if you're not familiar with it, Joshua 24:15, I encourage you to read it. But that's Joshua saying, the old saying, Harry S. Truman, right? The buck stops here. He says, ultimately, I am the responsible one for this instruction to my children. So Joshua 24:15 is a really good reference to establish that fact of why Paul here is instructing the fathers in Ephesus. He says, fathers, you guys. Now, fathers are called to not deliberately, okay? And you fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. So the fathers are called to not deliberately aggravate their children to the point of inciting pointless or reckless anger. Paul's saying, fathers, don't do that. Okay, here's the $1,000,000 question. Why would they do such a thing in the first place? That Paul has to mention this. Why would a father even want to do that? I'm not going to let you off the hook. You're going to have to think about it. Yeah. Well, that's why we got those mics.
I'm just thinking I'm not a male or a dad, but maybe sometimes they say, well, I want my kid to be tough, and they just need to learn and not be so sensitive. so they can kind of aggravate them and kind of prod them and poke them. Just a thought.
But they might mean well.
Yeah. They just don't know how to communicate.
Okay. Why would a father even do that? What else have we got?
Well, I think it's also just because fathers they're just sinful. We're all sinful. And whether you're a father or a mother or a sibling or your aunt gets on your nerves, I'm not saying Lily got on my nerves, but when someone frustrates us in our sinful nature, we can retaliate in an ungodly way. So if you're a father and your kid, breaks your window because they're outside throwing rocks and they're having fun, meanwhile they break your window, it's really easy for the dad to come down on them in an unbiblical manner and let his flesh get the better of him and, again, kind of retaliate in a way that's going to go too far and abuse his power as a father and really try to stick it to the kid. And he means well, but his flesh is getting in the way of it, and now he's gone too far.
That's a legitimate answer that I think can't be argued against, because that kind of behavior, without even guessing or anything, is sinful. So, yeah, you could say that. Why would a father even do that? Well, it's because of sin. Okay.
Also, sometimes he's just a fool.
He's just a fool.
Really,
Huh?
they are.
Okay. That they can be sinful, which is basically a trait or a characteristic of sinful, of sin. Okay. That's a viable observation.
Sometimes that's all they know. Like, that's how their dad related to them, and it's just what they know.
The sins of the father become the sins of the son. Okay. What else have we got? I mean, because the question is pretty legitimate. It's like Paul says, fathers, don't provoke your children recklessly or for no reason. Why would he even have to say that? Unless it was happening, or that it was common, or that it was something that by the Holy Spirit, God's instruction, Paul needed to address. Okay, what else? What else might be,
I don't think I can think of anything other than, because what I would have said would have the same thing Andrew said, like, nah, I mean, if your child does something that they're not supposed to do, or if you just come home in a bad mood and you're grouchy.
which would be sin.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the same, like, it's just something that you would do, like, you take it out on them, and not maybe always necessarily intentional, it's just your lack of self-control or your lack of your control over your emotions and your responses in those moments. Because I'm sure those dads feel terrible after about 10 minutes and they're sitting there in their thoughts like, what did I just do?
Not necessarily, but
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, Ephesus was a rowdy town. I'm sure a lot of, I don't know if any, maybe some drunkenness also came into play with that.
Yeah, I'm not looking for any one answer, because it's a very open-ended question, but it does kind of, to me, it was like, why would Paul even address that? But if it's in the Word of God, then it's there for a reason, right?
But I think another quick thought too is like the second part of that, because I think they kind of go, one, don't provoke your child, but here's what you need to do as far as instructing them and, teaching them in the ways.
Mm-hmm.
So if that's not happening too, I don't know if it's something also.
Those are all viable possibilities. Okay, I wasn't looking for any one answer.
I think, another one that you could just potentially throw out there too is we have to remember this is at the time of antiquity when the patriarchy really was the patriarchy. And he goes later on in the verses, he talks about masters and slaves. So if you were a man back then, you really were the man. I mean, your whole family lived with you. your son's wife, they all came and lived under your roof. So maybe knowing that at this time in human history, if you were a father, you really had power, and it could be abused during that time, the way the patriarchy was. And so maybe that's what Paul has in mind, like, hey, guys, dads, you guys have a lot of power, but in your sin, you can abuse it, so just be careful.
Well, consider that too, that as Brother Andrew just said, it is a very male-oriented society. Now, another question that kind of comes to my mind is the whole idea of children. My parents, even when they were like in their late 60s, early 70s, I was still their child. As far as children go, I was still one of them. Now, we also know that socially speaking, Jewish customs and all that, that when does a young man become a man? It's like around like 13, I think, or when do they have their bar mitzvah? 12? You saw that on Hallmark, didn't you? Now, we look at a 12-year-old and we say, that's a man. In our society, it's like not even a teenager yet. But now think about this. Since it's like a clan society as well, which you're going to have multiple families, and there still may be children to the patriarch, but they're grown men. Or for that matter, they're young ladies, but they're still somebody's child. So here are the two things that I kind of came up with. Okay, number one, why would they do that? And I think Sister Lily kind of touched on this one, or it was also just simply the result of sin. They were being mean-spirited. They were being jerks. They were being fools. But, and I think Sister Amber touched on this, a lot of it was from their own childhoods. The sins of the father become the sins of the son. People as they get older and they abuse children in any way, shape, or form. A lot of times it's because they themselves were abused. That could be a carryover thing that, just something that got inside of them, and maybe for them, they came to the conclusion that that was normal. And it wasn't, but they couldn't help it, Okay, so there's that idea. And this other one is, and this kind of goes with the whole idea of the patriarch and all that. And as far as growing up, as they begin to grow up, they begin to exercise, children-wise, they begin to exercise more of what? Independence. Now, a lot of times that can kind of clash with father, because father says, hey, I'm the king of the cave, right? And this growing independence, is that common in today's day and age? Oh gosh, yes. There's always that clash of all of a sudden they want to be on their own, and father's saying, hey, you know what? It's my house, my rules, blah, blah, blah. So you have that clash of growth and mental independence. So, from a child's perspective, Paul is saying, obey your parents. Okay, but from a father's perspective, and I can, it's like, if you're a father and you've raised children, you could probably see like steps along the way where they begin to be more independent. And sometimes with fathers, they deal with it one of two ways. They either learn to work with that, or they clash with it. See, they still want to be the top dog, so to speak. And just to kind of share something, and that's it. I remember as I was growing up and I was getting, obviously bigger and stronger, and my dad sometimes would kind of like want to wrestle with us. And it's like, well, when we were little, there was no contest. But as we got bigger, he kind of began to realize that it wasn't such an easy gig anymore. It was tougher. And I remember the last time, I honestly remember this, the last time that I kind of wrestled with my dad, and we were going down the hallway of his house, and he decided to kind of like shove me into the wall. Not really hard, but just kind of bump, like, kind of like, well, I guess you could say provoking me, but not in a manner of wanting to really make me angry. So then I responded in type, and then we just kind of started wrestling, a little bit in the hallway, and it turns out that I got the better of him. That's why that was the last time. But I also kind of like feeling like I lost something. Yeah. But I did understand that was kind of, my dad's way of trying to establish dominion, over me. But maybe a big part of that is that where, you have this clash where maybe there were fathers that were starting to see their sons and even their daughters exercising more independence, and for them, it's a matter of keeping your position, keeping your strength, and your all of this in a male oriented or a paternal environment. So these were just different things that kind of came up, But there's also, there's tons of other stuff, but we're going to go ahead and stop there. We may kind of revisit this a little bit more, but probably not. We'll just move on to about fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. There are 3 things there that I want to look at next Wednesday. Number 1, telling fathers, don't mistreat your children. For whatever reason, don't do that. That's not right. You want them to be part of the unity of the fellowship, not someone who's always going to be clashing with you over every little thing. Okay? But instead, Paul says, bring them up. That's number 1. Number 2, nurture them. And number 3, in the admonition of the Lord. That's what we're going to look at next Wednesday. We are having study next Wednesday, yes? Okay. Then next Wednesday. All right, let's go ahead and let's close with a word of prayer. Even so, Father